Hey everybody, my name is Sandra Elisa Loofbourow, and I am the tasting room director at the Crown, Royal Coffee's Lab and Tasting Room. Today, we're going to be going over the basics of brewing. The Crown is an open source coffee education center and tasting room. We're located at 2523 Broadway in Oakland, and I hope that you come in to visit us in person sometime. Royal Coffee has been in the Bay Area, a family-owned green coffee importing business for 42 years now, and they are the Crown's parent company. You're already on our website, so feel free to take a look and poke around to see if there's any coffees, classes, or events that may interest you. This is our code of conduct. It applies to everyone who enters our space physically or virtually and participates in any of our events. Our code of conduct is posted on our website, and the language from this code is derived from the Bay Area Coffee Community's code of conduct, which you can also reference on their website. Let's go over what we're going to talk about in this lecture. By the time this class is over, you will be able to identify and also understand various different brew methods. You'll know and be able to control the variables that affect brewing and extraction, and you'll also understand the basic techniques of successfully brewing coffee. Let's dive right in and start talking about the different kinds of brew methods we have available to us. This basically comes down to two styles of brewing. The first is infusion. Infusion brewing involves water flowing through a bed of coffee grounds before passing through a filter with the addition of fresh hot water with each pulse pour. Infusion brewing can be slightly more efficient at extraction because there's a constant supply of fresh, hot, and very hungry water being added to the grounds. However, infusion brewing also has more variables. Pour rate, water temperature, grind size, and drainage time all affect the final result and can be difficult to control from batch to batch. The other style is known as immersion. In this method, the grounds are fully submerged in all of the brew water all at once. A filter can be used to remove the grounds, or they can simply be allowed to settle to the bottom or push down to the bottom of the brewer. Immersion brewing tends to be a less intensive brew method, but it can also lead to siltiness or grittiness in the mouthfeel of the final brew if the grounds are left suspended in the brew water. Some people therefore like the added viscosity of this immersion brew, which might leave more of the lipids than an infusion brew where most of those fats and lipids are filtered out. But if this heavy, slick mouthfeel typical of immersion brews isn't exactly your cup of tea, an easy solution is to pour your immersion brew through a filter to remove any particulates. In immersion brewing, there's an increased risk of oversaturation. The water continues to extract the coffee until it reaches total saturation and has no more room for any more molecules. Remember, water will continue to extract the coffee as long as it's in contact with the coffee particles. Therefore, if you want to halt extraction, you must remove the grounds from the brew liquid. And the only way to control brew time in an immersion brew is through decanting the brew water out from the grounds. One thing to keep in mind for immersion brews is that we don't pre-infuse or bloom immersion brews. This adds one more temperature variation, and it'll be hard to recreate consistently since the water will begin to cool as soon as it hits the grounds and the cold vessel. Before we get too much farther, let's talk about some basic techniques we need to implement across all brew methods, regardless of device, regardless of brew style, regardless of coffee. First, always use clean, fresh water. Remember, water makes up 98% or more of your final brew, so if your water tastes like anything at all, those flavors will absolutely end up in your final cup of coffee. Second, always rinse your filter. This helps wash out any flavors of paper or cardboard that could impact your final cup, but it also helps preheat the filter and the brew device. This helps the brew water remain at a constant temperature when it hits the coffee grounds. If the brew device is too cold, the brew water will cool drastically, and you'll have no idea what temperature you're actually brewing at. Next, always weigh your doses, both your coffee dose and your water dose. If you don't know how much coffee you're using to brew, and you aren't keeping track of the ratio of water to coffee, then you simply have no control over your brew. In short, use a scale wherever you can. And finally, set a timer. Contact time is one of the key factors we can manipulate to affect extraction. And again, you can only control what you're measuring. Next, let's talk about some of the variables we need to control when brewing coffee. The first is brew time. The longer the water is in contact with the coffee, the more it will extract, and this will continue until the point of total saturation, meaning the water has no more room to take on any more molecules. Or conversely, it'll continue until the exhaustion of soluble content in the bean. Remember, about 30% of the coffee bean is water soluble, and we don't actually want all 30%. Controlling brew time is one significant way we can control extraction. Another is grind size, which correlates directly to the surface area. The larger the surface area exposed to the water, the easier it is for water to extract compounds from the coffee, and therefore the faster extraction will occur. Smaller grind size means more exposed surface area or more particles available to the water to extract. So grind size is another great way we can directly affect the rate of extraction. Another important factor is water temperature. Water is an excellent solvent. It's hungry for molecules to balance out its structure. As the temperature rises, molecules will move faster and faster, and this expands its reach and gives it access to more molecules. In short, extraction will occur faster with hotter water, and controlling the temperature of water will control the rate of extraction. Another variable is agitation. It can also be called turbulence. Agitating the coffee grounds will make them extract faster because the coffee's surface area will be exposed to more hungry water. There are several techniques we can employ to add and control agitation, like stirring the bloom or adjusting the rate of pour, using specific pulse pours, pouring in concentric circles, or creating a spin on the surface of the brew. But remember, these techniques must be repeatable. If all you're doing with this step is adding a chaos factor that you'll never be able to mimic, then it's better to skip this entirely. And finally, brew ratio. Deciding on a brew ratio means deciding how much coffee and how much water to use, which will affect how much of the coffee ends up getting extracted. This is usually expressed by saying 1 part coffee and then between 10 and 20 parts water. For example, a 1:15 ratio could use 20 grams of coffee and 300 grams of water. In specialty coffee, we usually stick to between a 1:15 or up to a 1:18 ratio or even higher. Let's get more specific about infusion brewing. The first phase of infusion brewing is the bloom. This is where a small amount of water, usually double the dose of coffee, is poured over the grounds in order to fully saturate them and release some of the carbon dioxide. Too much gas trapped in the bean can lead to bubbling and unexpected turbulence in the brew. In short, it's one more variable. Pre-wetting the grounds gets this turbulence out of the way and allows for more even extraction through the rest of the brew. When blooming your coffee, be sure to get all of the coffee wet as soon as possible. Leaving clumps of dry grounds only creates more extraction variables. Stirring the grounds can help ensure that all of the coffee is saturated and interacting with all of the water in as little time as possible. The second phase of the brew is known as the drawdown or as extraction. Drip coffee forms a sedimentary filter bed, which means that layers of sediment, in this case coffee grounds, with different particle sizes are deposited on top of each other, creating horizontal layers of matter. Controlling how these particles settle in order to allow proper drainage and even exposure of all parts of the brew bed to the brew water is one of the barista's greatest challenges. A properly executed bloom phase and good pour technique are crucial here. Agitating the brew bed after the bloom phase can cause a rearrangement of these particles and often leaves the fines falling all the way to the bottom, which will slow drainage to the point of choking the filter. For this reason, messing with the brew bed during extraction is not usually recommended. The depth of the brew bed also has a significant impact on flow rate. Deeper beds take longer to flow through. That's to say, flow rate will decrease with the distance it has to travel. So being aware of the tool you're using, the device, and how deep the brew bed is in your current infusion brew device is important to controlling these variables. Finally, the end phase, the last portion of the brew, which can be the most critical because unpleasant and bitter flavors are extracted during this portion. These flavors can be crucial to bringing balance to the cup, but aggressive extraction at this point of the brew is unwise. The coffee has already given up most of its soluble material, and what's left may just be carbohydrates and plant matter. So those are the three phases of infusion brewing. Let's look at how they differ from the phases of immersion brewing. Immersion brews may seem simpler than infusion brews, but it's still only through the careful control of variables that we can create a successful brew. Remember our brewing basics from before. Always use clean, fresh water. Always rinse your filter and always preheat your brew device. A scale and a timer should be a given at this point. So the first step of an immersion brew is to pour all the brew water into all of the grounds. It's important to get all of the water interacting with all of the coffee as quickly as possible so that extraction happens at an even rate. Unlike infusion brewing, blooming an immersion brew is not a good idea. The water will cool at an unpredictable rate, creating circumstances and rates of extraction that will be difficult to recreate. The best advice is just to skip the bloom altogether. Agitation is a particularly important step for immersion brews. First, a stir at the beginning of extraction will disperse any clumps of dry coffee that may have formed, ensuring that the water has equal access to all of the coffee grinds. After 30 seconds or so, a crust will have formed at the top of your brew device, similar to the crust we see during cuppings. Even though these grinds are saturated with water, they have been lifted above the waterline and are therefore extracting at a different rate than the coffee particles that are fully submerged. So we've got to break that crust and reincorporate those grinds with a stir. Subsequent stirs will help with diffusion. The water closest to the coffee grinds will become oversaturated and will therefore be a less efficient solvent. Adding a stir at this time will allow water that's not yet saturated to get access to the coffee particles. Time your stirs carefully, keeping track of what time during the brew you're implementing them and how long you're stirring or how many stirs you're using each time. Finally, we decant the brew. This is a critical step in immersion brews because as long as the brew water is in contact with the ground coffee, it will continue extracting. It must be removed. This can be confusing because some immersion brewers also double as carafes. Still, the brew should be poured out and served as soon as you've reached your total brew time. Some immersion brewers have built-in filters which can help strain out any wayward grinds and help clean out the mouthfeel. If your immersion brewer doesn't include a filter and you want to try this method out, simply pour your immersion brew through a pour-over device with its filter in place. Alrighty, so we know what brew styles are available to us, we know what variables we need to control, and we know what happens during each phase of the brew. Now let's talk about dialing in. This is the process of finding the best brew specs for a specific coffee. Typically, a barista will brew a coffee repeatedly, carefully manipulating variables with each extraction and then evaluating each cup before choosing a recipe that's repeatable and that yields the best flavors. Start by choosing a recipe. Determine your brew ratio. That's the coffee at dose and brew water. Determine your water temperature, your grind size. All of these are specific to your chosen brew device. It also depends on your coffee roast level, the days off roast, and even the coffee origin, which can all impact extraction and may change the recipe you want to use. Once you've chosen a recipe to start with, brew it and then taste. Dryness and bitterness are often characteristics of over-extraction because tannins, melanoidins, and plant matter all come out much more readily at the end of the brew. Conversely, sourness and thinness, which are characteristics of a lot of acids and not enough other stuff to balance it, can be an indication of an under-extracted brew. For more details on what's extracted when, please check out our class on extraction basics. We talk about the specific compounds within the coffee bean and how readily they come out during extraction. But the most important takeaway here is to trust your palate. Does it taste good, or does it taste like it needs a little bit of work? Okay, so you've tasted your coffee. For one reason or another, it's not quite right, and you're sure that you can get a better extraction by tweaking the recipe. It can be really tempting to do a million things at once. Let's say it tastes over-extracted. Let's coarsen, and let's lower the water temperature, and let's raise my dose to lower the amount of extraction happening in my brew. Let's say you do all three of those things, and the brew ends up tasting spectacular. How will you know which variable made the biggest difference in the end? In contrast, if it tastes terrible, which of these changes was the worst offender, and how did these variables interact with each other? For example, if you coarsen the grind, that would probably shorten brew time as the water would have less resistance to flow through. However, increasing the dose would counteract this because more mass would mean more resistance in the brew bed. The moral of the story is change one variable at a time so that you can monitor the impacts that this one variable has on your brew. Then, taste your brew again. Continue this cycle of brewing and changing one variable until you found the most delicious version of your coffee under these circumstances on this day. Always stop before your palate gives up on you. Make controlled, concise changes, and when your coffee tastes sweet and smooth, don't push just to get a little more out of it. Your palate is your most important tool that you have at your disposal when brewing, and over time, you'll learn how to have your palate guide you and tell you what changes would make the most significant positive impact on your brew. Let's review what we've learned today. There's two main brew styles, immersion and infusion. Each of these has at least 3 phases. Specific reactions happen during each of these phases, and it's up to us as baristas to use the tools at our disposal with skill and intention. There are a number, almost an infinite number, of variables when brewing. As a barista, we have to do our utmost to make sure our brew recipes are repeatable time after time. To do so, we must be fully aware of the variables that impact extraction the most and how we're affecting these variables with our technique and our tools. The most important extraction variables that we touched on here are brew time, or contact time, grind size, or surface area, water temperature, agitation of the brew, and the brew ratio. There are also some basic techniques that we must employ across all brews, like rinsing and preheating our filters and brew devices, using fresh, clean, hot water, and using a scale and timer for all our brews. There are also a whole slew of techniques that are dependent on brew device, on brew style, on roast level and age of roast, and even on the origin of the coffee. We must use all this information to dial a brew recipe that yields a delicious and repeatable cup of coffee. At the end of the day, your palate is your most important tool. Taste your brews and make changes one at a time, then taste your brews again. It may feel at first like you're grasping at straws, but over time your palate will learn what over-extraction and under-extraction tastes like, and your comfort level will grow to the point that you know exactly how to address each of these issues in your brews. Please do refer to my class on understanding extraction for more information, but in the meantime, just keep brewing. Thanks again for joining me to learn about the basics of brewing. For more information, including articles about brewing, all of our crown analysis, which includes brew analysis for each of our crown jewels, and updates on upcoming classes and events, please take a look at our website. I hope you had as much fun as I did getting into the nitty-gritty of brewing basics today. If you ever have any questions or need more info, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@royalcoffee.com or give us a call at 510-652-4256. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you again here soon.